So this is one of the interesting elements of Buddhism that actually it absorbed after its origination. So originating in India, any rituals that Buddhist monks would have practiced at that time would have been more in line with like traditional yoga or meditative practices. It's when Buddhism moves into China and then throughout Asia that we start to see it interact with Confucianism and Daoism and pick up those local religious and cultural or regional rituals, which is why it's often ancestral based. But we don't see that sort of ancestral worship in, again, it's originating Indian traditions, the ones that more closely resemble Hinduism. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you look at the actual core of the Buddhist teachings, you'll notice that the primary thing is sort of like what we see in Catholicism, or the primary mode of spirituality that you're supposed to be living. The ideal state is to marry the church, right? Or to become a Buddhist monk. And so it's really just lay people who aren't at that level of spiritual progress that they're able to commit themselves entirely to the monastery, that then they can participate as laypersons by supporting the monastery, right, through donations and practice. And I mentioned how they donate their time and during meals and things like this. So there's lots of ways that they support the monastic life, right, and community in that sense, but they marry and have children. But Buddhist monks, again, they're celibate, supposedly, although there's lots of actual sexual activities that go on within any sort of religious institution, right? People are not, we're fallible, people break the rules. But the idea was that it's maybe certain types of sexual activity which are prohibited. I think we talked a little bit about that in regards to same-sex relationships, right? It's seen as fine, right? As long as whatever the sexual act that you're engaging in is respectful, right, in line with Buddhist morality, right, there's consent and these types of things, then they really don't have anything to say about it. But marrying, making those commitments, right, that is attaching yourself to Maya, right, attaching yourself to samsara. Same with, yeah, having children, right, you love them, you care about them, right, you are so attached to this temporary life. So again, the ideal is not to be a part of that. And so it wouldn't make sense then if Buddhism required a lot of ancestral worship, right? Because the ideal is to not be anybody's ancestor, right? And not be passing on, adding new people to the cycle of samsara, as it were. News focus has been more national and state. If you all saw, but it is now a felony to identify as trans in Texas.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. They're totally working to dismantle the Department of Education. All right. It's okay we're intellectual humility. It's okay to make mistakes and to don't. And honestly, unfortunately, one of the things that you learn, or at least I've learned this from philosophy, right? Because so much of it is about learning how to argue well and be persuasive, right? There's a lot of rhetoric. But the idea is that, you know, once you start, I mean, this was speaking to the who just had the debate tournament with that summer. It's not so much always what you say, but how you say it. Power in confidence, right? So like if you are really confident in something, most likely people won't question it. Now that's not always good. Right? Again, I do want to encourage, especially those of us socialized as women, to be more confident in stating our positions, because we have been socialized not to value our own opinions and things and not to trust them, right? And to defer to outside authority. So we are socialized to do what's called downplay, which is if and when we get the nerve to voice our opinion, we'll usually couch it in something like, well, that's just my view, but you know, people might disagree. Like we invite disagreement, right? We open the door to the fact that we might be wrong. So this is why in our papers, I encourage you not to use I, like personal pronouns when you write, because this is not something that is just supposed to reflect your personal opinions, right? You've done research. You are giving other people reason to believe that these things are true. So it doesn't matter what you believe, right? These things should stand regardless of your personal position. And that's really, really tough for a lot of us to do. Summer, so wonderful. I know we really need to be doing more like explicit counter education on these things. Because we're really not encouraged to have confidence in what we say, in what we think, in how we look, and really anything about our existence. And so when we force each other to do that, when we support each other doing those things out loud, actually, okay, this fits really well with what we're talking about this week, because I am not like a super woo-woo-y person personally. Like, I'm very empirically oriented. I'm very Humean in my skepticism of the world. But one thing I do love that I think captures the power of language and relates to some of the better intentions of witchcraft is the idea of spell casting, right? That saying something out loud, right? Verbalizing it gives it power, right? That is the basis of what casting a spell is in witchcraft, right? Is you're literally just using the power of words, your voice, putting your ideas into an audible sound in some form that others can receive it, that is powerful. And in that sense, in a non-woo-woo-y sense, right, in just the ways we've been talking about, I think that that's really, really true. Celia, absolutely. If you have done any sort of research about the witch trials and the burning of witches or the burning of women throughout the world, you will notice that these women were all healers, right? They were all women who practiced herbal medicine, exactly. And there's a lot of, yes, yep, all of the ways in which we nourish our bodies, right? Even if it's ointments or oils, right? A lot of people are into oils and tinctures now, or aromatherapy, right? Or crystals, right? There's all these types of things that we see now that, again, people are sort of looking to as an alternative source of power, energy, wisdom, whatever the particular end goal is. And the idea is those things are being found in nature, right? In a lot of these what are called neo-pagan traditions, right? So new, but picking up on something ancient, right? And so pagan there is capturing, again, just any tradition that wasn't Christian, right? Post-Christianity. And so the idea here is that this aligns itself a lot with feminist theology, because the pagan traditions most often are even more celebratory of the divine feminine than the traditions we even learned about last week, right? So last week we were looking at some newer religions, Sikhism, Baha'i, Afro-Caribbean mixtures. And the idea there was that they were, right, branching out from these historical major world religious traditions because they were looking to address specific inequalities, right? Whether it be related to gender, race, caste, right, or all of the above. And the idea here is that Wicca, a New Age spirituality, even some elements of what you might consider to be something that's like Satan worship, right, are really just rejections of patriarchal religious traditions and celebrations of divine femininity, right? And they're not always, you'll see, just of the feminine, right? So a lot of Wiccan traditions will celebrate divine duality, right? So a male and female entity, right? Sometimes it can be three parts of the feminine identity, right? You're familiar with the crone, right? The huntress, and then I forget what the youngest one is, the beauty, but yeah. Yeah. So other thoughts so far on some of what we've been discussing. We've been connecting it to to things in real life. Some comments here. When you receive a compliment, you don't deflect it because people see you as stuck up or too confident. Yes, good. So women are often couched as selfless or selfish or egotistical if they don't, deflect all types of, if they're not, the word is pejorative, to put down, like if you're not constantly putting yourself down, right, then a woman is seen to be very full of herself or trying to be a man. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so this happens all the time, right? Women's comfort is secondary. Their emotions are considered burdens on those around them, right? So often the burden is placed on those socialized as girls and women to keep the peace, as it were, right? But all that means is that you're holding all of that chaos inside of you, right? And taking that burden on yourself so that other people don't have to, be uncomfortable or deal with it. And that is absolutely ridiculous and unjust. Yeah. So it's a very weird thing, honestly. If women are expressing that they are confident in their bodies, they get criticized. Yep, right? Because nobody wants a woman to be confident in their body. If they're confident in their bodies, then society loses a lot of power over them, right? It's that insecurity, that need to constantly be seeking, again, if we're tying this back to Buddhism, seeking things that are temporary, attaching yourself to things that are temporary, that keeps the, mechanisms of capitalism working in that sense. Other thoughts? Seeking validation from masculine ideals. Yes, absolutely. Right. So this is, something that you'll all have to sort of figure out for yourselves. I don't have an answer. It's going to be especially difficult to find an answer to this right now, too. But if you exist in a patriarchal system, which we do, right, and you are not a beneficiary of that system, or you are to some extent, right, you're privileged enough to maybe have a role within the system, but not privileged enough to, not be oppressed by still a large, significant portion of it. You have to ask yourself, how much of a part in that system do you want to play, right? Do you want this whole idea of like being able to change something from within, right? How much of your own values do you have to sacrifice to do that, right? Where will the line be drawn? And again, it's difficult to say, right? So you have, of course, examples of people fighting on the outside of these institutions that are doing really meaningful, powerful work, but then you also have people inside, right? And perhaps some level of that pragmatism is, maybe we need both. And so it might be for you to decide which part you want to play in. But again, yeah, if you're a part of a system that rewards a certain type of behavior, a certain type of person, a certain type of way of being, a certain way of treating others, either treating them as humans or treating them as objects, right? Then unfortunately, we've seen in a free market capitalist society that does not tend to raise up the most moral individuals, right? The people that have the most generous of spirits or that are the most humanitarian, right? We see a lot of sociopaths. We see perhaps even psychopaths. I don't know them enough personally, but right, there's clearly a lack of empathy, or an unwillingness or inability to empathize with anyone but themselves. And so, right, how can you fix a system like that from the inside? If you can't, what do you do otherwise? Again, there's no easy answers to this, but understanding what the problems are might help. And again, I think you're all pointing out some really wonderful things about the role of education, right? How we need to actively be teaching our children these things, teaching future generations these things. I mean, hell, I'm even teaching my mom these things. So it doesn't even have to be passed forward, right? We can work in both directions. Other thoughts? It is our last day of class, so feel free to anything you want to talk about. In what, I mean, because all types of views can affect people.
Yes,
So, yeah.
yeah.
In what way are you thinking in particular? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we were a little too naive, and I say we as in like my generation, which may or may not be a part of. But I think my generation really underestimated how influential our parents' generation of notions of masculinity impacted.
Yes, yeah,
Right?
definitely.
And like, of course, I grew up in the 90s, so obviously it's filled with all types of misogyny that I didn't see at the time but see now. And it's like, oh, right, those are the ones that are like at the age to lead now, right? Still not great. And so there's, right, we want to embrace intellectual, getting back to what started this conversation off, is we want to embrace intellectual humility. It's okay if we don't know the truth. None of us know the truth. That's the idea, right? We're all seeking. And we can be better seekers of that truth if we're willing to share what we think we know, as long as we're willing to listen, right, to other people as well. Not everyone is really willing to listen. That is absolutely right. Here's another moment where, so I often quote Hume at moments like these because I think it's true, but there's also a part of me that's really takes issue with it, and I'll talk about why. So the Hume quote is in a very short reading, which is really wonderful. I recommend you read it. We're going to read it in my philosophy of religion class on miracles. So David Hume is talking about, David Hume is an empirical philosopher who is skeptical, right, of people who claim to have absolute knowledge, right, knowledge of past, future, present, all of these things. Yay! And so, of course, that's going to include God, right, because God is meant to have existed at all time, right? So that it sort of follows from his skepticism, a skepticism of religion. And so he has this paper where he's talking specifically about belief in miracles and what epistemic issues we might take with the willingness to believe in miracles despite all of our previous experiences, which are of non-miracles. But one of the things that he talks about in this paper is, the ability to reason with people who disagree with you. And so, actually, shoot, it might even not be on the paper on miracles. It might be on the paper on the soul. They're both good. They're both good. We're going to read them both. But he's talking about people who look inward and experience something permanent, right? And the idea was that if he's talking to someone who thinks that, he can no longer reason with them, because when he looks inward and doesn't experience a soul, right? So he's already recognizing that they're operating from two very different starting points, right? One which he can't change and they won't change, right? And so if that's the case, he says, right, you can't reason with that person. But now that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't continue to talk to these people, right? Because what I'm seeing a lot of, especially right now, is this, like, again, if anyone was ever a Trump supporter, you never talk, you cut them out of your life. But the thing is that that's what they want, right? They are isolationists in their ideology. They want people to stay siphoned off and only hear from people in their echo chamber. So in that sense, right, even if Hume is right, and we may not be able to reason with certain people and they just really aren't willing to listen, that doesn't mean that we should cut them out entirely. Now, if someone's dangerous or toxic, of course, right, you have to set healthy boundaries and cut off that abusive behavior. But, right, if we're just talking about the sharing of ideas and disagreement in conversation with someone, right, those, again, I sort of built my career on the idea that those conversations are worth having, even if they're not listening, right? I have to hope that even just if a handful of my students in every class I teach are listening, that's enough. Even if it's just one, right? That's enough for me, right? I have to assume or I have to operate under that level of skepticism to feel good about what I do. If it's even just one person, right, even if most people don't hear it, I still think there's some value, right, in being presented with that information. So again, it's up to you to decide. There are lots of people I don't have conversations with anymore that I don't engage in certain types of conversations with more. That's just life and personal preference, and also just, what mood you're in that moment. So Leah, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of articles now about how the next wave of feminism should be like a matriarchy, because if you recall back from the beginning of the quarter when we looked at indigenous traditions, matriarchies were about egalitarianism, and they were about focusing on the care and welfare of children, right? That is one of the most fundamental differences between a matriarchal system and a patriarchal system in order to control, right? And yeah, people want to call it a welfare state. Great. Yeah. I don't know why that's bad. That's what it is,
Mhm.
right? Because we're taking care of the people who aren't able to take care of themselves.
Yes.
And if you are studying the sciences, right, hopefully you've learned that the theory of evolution is not survival of the fittest, it's
Mm-mm.
cooperation,
Mhm.
right? That is what has allowed humanity to survive. Our ability to take care of other people before we take care of ourselves, not at the
Yep.
expense of ourselves. Yeah, so this is again going back to the indigenous traditions that we studied at the beginning of the term. This is like that one reading about the female healer, Shostak, um, who talks about one, how it was so rare that there were female healers, but the fact that women have higher pain tolerance actually makes them more capable of taking on the burdens of the healing practice because it is so physically draining, right?
Mhm.
To do that, it doesn't come free of cost, right? The idea is that it's all about some sort of interconnected relationship, right? Where we're exchange, right? You're not taking or giving, you're or without giving, right? That there's some sort of what's the word I'm thinking of? Like you're mutually invested. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna play devil's advocate. This is one of those things where I sort of see it like in Taoism, right? Where they were searching for immortality and then were able to come up with these elixirs that became medicinal, right?
Mhm.
Same thing with healing, right? Medicinal healing, herbal healing practices, right? The things we've been talking about. Even some of the other stuff that might not be based in like a physical object, but can still have very like therapeutic benefits,
Okay.
right?
Mhm.
Um, so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about because of what we're learning now um, about genetic trauma, right? Generational trauma, muscle memory, but I think it's something more than that, right? And it's more than just, certain types of instincts that get passed on, right? Of like in any animal, right? Your certain animals are born with certain instincts. We call it in humans, we call it our lizard brain, right? That like pattern recognition part of us that helps us, pick out eyeballs in the bushes and,
Right.
things like this. But I think that for groups of people and then smaller, right, thinking more locally to families, right, and our ancestral heritage, like I wouldn't be surprised if that stuff is in your family, right, in your bodies. And so those if you're into physics and you're learning about quantum mechanics,
Mhm.
right, so how the smallest bits of matter in the universe operate at a quantum level, it turns out that they sort of violate the laws that we're most familiar with. So, are you guys familiar with something called action and right? So, once two atoms have been in contact with one another and have a certain type of bond, when they are apart from one another, regardless of how far apart they are in space, any change that happens in one is reflected in the other. That's called action at a distance. I wouldn't be surprised if like those moments of connection, Celia, you felt, right? Even whether we call it spiritual or physical, like I wouldn't be surprised if, right, we're talking about some of the same stuff. Actions they're real somehow. Right? That people are sharing similar types of stories, right? That there are these patterns in human behavior that we see in these different religious traditions, right? Again, we might ask ourselves, what are we to make of them? This diversity of thought, shared features, right? And this does tend to be one of them. These types of religious experiences, right? So just
I
offering another explanation in case there are any other skeptics out there. I think also, like if I'll just share. So I was thinking about my dad a lot this morning, um, who passed at the end of last year. Um, Actually, I don't know if I can talk about this without being emotional, so maybe I won't. Oh yes, tell us about that, please.
so
Awesome. Okay, thank you for sharing that. I think I collected myself, so I think I can share what I was going to share. Space and time. So my dad used to have some interesting. My dad had a lot of, personal psychological stuff going on, which is another story. But part of it for him was tied up in religious belief. And so unfortunately for me, like my anecdotal experience with religious experience is through him. And so it's all sort of tainted with like this grandiose narcissism. Right. And so this is sort of what I think this is what makes me think of that Hume quote is like at some point, right, when people are just coming from those different standpoints, those different experiences, we're just not able to know. These are some things we're just not able to believe or to see from these differing perspectives, which again is why it's so important that we share them and be open to listening about them. I love listening about it. I was not that it's the same, but like, you know, people who are skeptics, but like, I want it to be true, right? I want these things to be true. I think it would be so cool if it were. Yeah. Anyone else have any stories, thoughts that they want to share? We only have about 7 minutes of class left. Thank you again, Celia. So one thing I know is that the burning of incense, right, or the burning of offerings, right, in temples is about connecting, right, the physical to the spiritual realm. So I wonder if like the tethering of things does something similar. Good. And I was just teaching this in my Eastern philosophy class because we get more into each of those traditions. So instead of just spending 1 week on each of them, right, we spend 2. And when we got into Daoism, we talk about Zhuangzi, who was Lao Tzu's most famous disciple. And he very famously talked about, you know, dreaming of being a butterfly, but then realizing, well, when I'm awake, or when I think I'm awake, am I just a butterfly dreaming of being a man, right? Like, which one is real? You guys might also be familiar with the Western analog of this comes from Rene Descartes, who very famously has the dream argument, right? How can we tell if we're dreaming or if we're awake, right? Because really any sort of test is something that you could theoretically dream of. So that ends up leading into, you know, how do we know we're not sleeping right now, dreaming of this moment? How do we know we're not a brain in a vat? And then you get the Matrix. So how do we even prove that the external world exists? How do I prove that all of you exist, right? That you're not just figments of my imagination? It's surprisingly more difficult than you might think. Yeah, that's definitely a part of Islamic theology. They go through, they have a very deep theology of prophecy. And the different levels at which it happens, and dreaming is one of the main ways. And so again, whether it's physical, right, an awareness, something you're picking up on from the earth, right, wherever that signal is coming from. And so, all right, if this is the last minute, last parting wisdom I can give you all is that if we're talking about knowledge, right, and I do encourage you all to embrace a healthy level of skepticism, right? At least just to ask the questions, right? Regardless of whatever answers you come to. Trust your bodies. Trust what your body is telling you, okay? Again, talking about all of the amazing things that they've evolved to do and all of the wisdom that is carried therein. That gut feeling, those gut feelings that you have, right? The hairs that stand up on your neck, just those little red flags. Listen to all of those things. That will be your best guide. Wherever you think that wisdom is coming from, listen to it. All right, it's been a wonderful quarter, you all. I hope you get through finals okay. Please do join just my regular office hour personal Zoom room. The information is on Canvas. I can email it again if anyone needs it, but on Thursday, or reach out if you want to meet at a different time this week or next. But next week I will just be grading. Lots and lots of grading. So try, totally fine. But if you did think you wanted to meet with me, let's try to do it this week. But we can make something work before the end of the term. Okay. It was lovely chatting with you all. Good luck. Bye.